So our final presentation before lunch is from Matt Stiak, Director of Cyber Risk Management at Delta Dental of California, and Jason Sinchak, who's a principal at the Level 9 Group. Matt's work in cyber spans 2 decades with security-conscious organizations, including Fortune 100 insurance and financial services firms. And Jason helps Fortune 500 organizations understand the evolving cyber threat landscape and equips them with appropriate defenses. He has executed hundreds of deep dive penetration tests specializing in enterprise networks, web applications, mobile applications, and hardware devices. Please welcome Matt Stiak and Jason Sinchak.
You have the clicker, Jason?
There it is.
There we go. All right, I guess you're on clicker duty. All right, well, first of all, a heartfelt thank you to MITRE. It's really an honor to be able to come here and present at the first ATT&CKcon on what we believe to be a fantastic framework. And for the hundreds in attendance and the thousands watching around the world, thank you for coming in to hear us talk. I want to give a quick shout out here to my team, Alan, Billy, Quee, Brian, Irina, and Pat. You guys are the ones who are really doing it and really making this happen day in and day out. And none of this would have been possible without you, so thank you.
And I'm Jason Sinchak. As was mentioned, my career kind of started off in network penetration testing, evolved into hardware and things like that. Did quite a bit of breach investigation around there, and the two of them kind of come together to really shine on why I like the MITRE ATT&CK Framework and why I think it's useful. And honestly, I think it's worth just mentioning that someone was brave enough to go out there and put a stake in the ground and say, this is what we're going to focus on now. Because I've been in places where we tried to develop our own frameworks and focus, and it's obviously a hotly contested area of, this should be there, that shouldn't be there. So to have something out there to kind of get the ball moving is more than helpful.
And I think we covered introductions already. So
so we're going to kind of kick this off with we are what we believe are the security everyman. And what we mean by that is obviously we're going to be talking about agile, continuous improvement, a lot of buzzwords. But before we get into that, kind of reflect a little bit on where we are at the current state. I think there's a lot of people here that are probably familiar with working in blue team environments that may be missing things, whether it's logs, resources, structure may not be there. There's always a thrust to say, once we get this or that, we're going to be where we need to be. And I've seen that in many organizations, different industries, and it seems like it's more the norm than the exception. And so what we've kind of come to accept is that that's just the way it's going to be. And what we need to try and do is develop a way of functioning in that environment where you may always be behind, you may not have the things that you want, but leveraging something like ATT&CK can be very helpful in helping you prioritize what you're doing.
So what's the big idea? Well, it really came to us, we read the blogs, we read the tweets, and I think there's a lot of evidence out there in the industry that people are successfully adopting the framework and are using it in their organizations. And the theory behind it is sound. And so we believe, as your average run-of-the-mill security organization, that we could do this. We could be like the big guys, and we could leverage ATT&CK.
And so this is kind of what we wanted. We were kind of under the impression that if we run the scripts, we run the tools, we get the data, we execute the techniques, we're going to get our graph that looks good. And you kind of notice when you start down that path of collecting all this data, the reality tends to sink in, especially if you're in an environment that may not have all the resources that you need, that, what are we going to do with this? And the fundamental question that tends to come up is how are we going to deal with the results? Because effectively, when you're collecting that much data, you're building up a large database about all the things that may be wrong with your organization. So unless you have a system in place to manage that workflow, track what you've tested, what you haven't tested, and see that through to actually fixing it or rationalizing why you're not fixing it, you can end up in a tough situation of essentially admitting that you know about all these bad things, but you're not doing anything about it.
So, once we got our head out of the clouds and set to work on this, I think we realized pretty quickly maybe it's not that easy. So the first mistake that I think that we made when we set about to adopt ATT&CK is that we spent a significant amount of time up front developing our process, arguing through our workflow, arguing about how we were going to measure, what we were going to measure, arguing about what data we needed. We built out JIRA prototypes so that we could track our work. We built a scoring database. We wrote a bunch of documentation. And we did all of this before we invited the team to start working within this framework. I mean, why wouldn't they just want to use all this stuff? It's brilliant, isn't it? We came to realize pretty quickly that adopting ATT&CK is really a cultural change. And it's a change in the way that we expect people on our teams to think about the security problem. And it's a change in the way that we expect them to behave. I like that we've seen several examples where people talk about the kill chain or people talk about CVE. And so, I think it's right to acknowledge those as analogs to the type of change that we're expecting people to make as we adopt ATT&CK into our organizations.
Yeah, so to kind of summarize some of the three key issues that we've seen, been down this road a few times and on the journey that we were on specifically, the framework itself, is, if you've been in the business for a long time, it's not earth-shattering, right? If you've been pen testing for a long time, or if you've been in breach investigation or incident response, you've probably seen a lot of these. It's obviously refreshing to see them all in one spot and kind of feel a little validated that you know what you're looking at. But it is disruptive in other ways. And from a cultural perspective, it disrupts how, in many cases, a blue team may have worked in the past. So you have SOC resources or someone that creates rules, and they've kind of operated off of more or less intuition, and that's out of design. It's not too dissimilar from something that you would see in the pen test space where there might not be a lot of process around what that person is doing, but they're a smart guy. They go and implement a rule based on something that they've seen in the past, and as a result, maybe they catch some things and they were right. So that is a cultural issue that you tend to have to deal with, because when you bring ATT&CK into the question and they have to now move away from intuition of kind of acting in an ad hoc manner and work within the confines of a framework to say, we're going to focus on these issues, you run into some of those problems. And if you can kind of persevere through that and get through those issues, you'll gain some transparency into what's actually going on with your team, what they're actually looking at once they're focused on things like this, and you get a lot of portability around knowledge. Historically, when everything is moving based on intuition and gut feel, if someone leaves the organization or someone new comes, you lose some of that institutional knowledge that may have been used to construct some of the monitoring strategy previously. So if you get everyone looking at the same matrix, the same strategy, same focus, you get a lot more portable information.
So now the second thing that we learned is don't underestimate the amount of time that you have to spend framing your outcome and helping people understand where you're going. The example that came up for me personally is we were looking at the technique data compression, my bingo people, and the question naturally came up, why are we looking at this? This has a high degree of false positive. Everybody's using data compression as a technique. Why don't we just go back to the way that we were doing things before and think about what the attackers are doing, and we're going to measure and build against that? And so this highlighted the example that we really needed to focus on reiterating the message that our goal is to determine whether or not we can detect this specific technique. You use that later on, sure, in a constructive manner, maybe if we're looking at the overall attack chain, or we will use it in other manners. But really the goal for today is to figure out how we can measure that particular technique, how we can detect that technique. There's a saying that says that by the time you are tired of repeating something, people have just started listening to you. So this educational challenge, we, of course, in a stroke of genius, decided to compound it by not only introducing ATT&CK, but also asking our team to adopt Agile at the same time. And so Agile comes with its own suite of jargon, processes, and educational challenges. And so if you decide to follow in any of our footsteps, you have to account for that as well as you make the transition.
And one of the final barriers that we experience is really around resources. And in my experience, especially in the security community or in the technical space, there's a lot of really great solutions to things that work really well in small groups or kind of when they're designed. But when you implement them and operationalize them, the wheels can kind of fall off. You've seen this with authentication. Obviously, you can crank down on authentication by applying two-factor, more authentication. And what happens is people can't do work. They'll just stop using it. They'll find some other way around it. And when you see that happen, it tends to inform you of how maybe you can carry yourself the next time around. And one thing that we kind of see rapid when you bring a framework like this in and you're asking people to kind of reinvent their jobs while continuing operations, you're asking them to basically build while they're running, right? So we're running the marathon and we're trying to keep up with operations, we're trying to monitor events, we're trying to do incident response, and now we have to build out this framework and start to shift our focus towards this when you already don't have very many cycles and operations are limited and everyone's putting in 40, 50-hour weeks.
And all of that, these barriers to adoption just sound exhausting. Who am I kidding? It's exhilarating. It's awesome to be part of this kind of change, right? And there's a quote by Dr. Bobby Hoffman. He wrote a book, Hack Your Motivation. And he says that motivation can only reach its peak if you believe that effort, not ability, is the limiting factor in success.
So attacking these barriers, using Agile, using Agile to your advantage. I'll be the first to admit that personally I was never a fan of applying Agile to everything. Agile is really popular in software development, startups. I've been part of those. I know why it's successful, but it's obviously a trend now to kind of hack it on to everything that's going on, and it's going to somehow improve that process. Some cases they're right, some cases they're not. But in this situation, we didn't really go out seeking how we could shove Agile into this because that would be a good thing for management to see. It just happened to be that, normal people, we're not Agile masters. We just took some things from it that made sense, and it actually didn't have a lot of overhead, and it reduced our workload and just made perfect sense for the problems that we're dealing with.
So the thing is, we're in a constant state of flux, and Jason alluded to it. We deal with operational pressures. An incident comes up. Your boss sends an email asking for a report on the latest threat actor or something that he read in Newsweek. And we also deal with a constant state of change in terms of the attack profile is constantly shifting as IT evolves and vulnerabilities are introduced to the environment. The threat profile constantly changes as attackers continue to evolve their techniques. And so, we believe that Agile allows us to manage those risks by allowing you to work in small, discrete steps so that if one of these operational distractions comes along, you don't lose your place where you're at. At worst, you're going to be reprioritizing the work that you didn't do in the next sprint because it all will stay in the backlog if you weren't able to get to it in the window that you allocated for yourself.
Yeah, so not being Scrum Masters, we tried to come up with a way that we could handle this workflow that made the most sense, but it wasn't going to be a burden on the resources to actually execute. And one of the ways that we came up with this is here, but obviously each organization is different and how you want to go about tackling it is different. You might have different tasks, different projects that you want to create, but the fundamental way that we seem to see that it works is to do development tasks and testing tasks. And obviously testing tasks cover things like execution of individual techniques, as many people have talked about. Development tasks actually capture the outcome of that. So deficiencies that were recognized through the testing of those techniques. And what we call building blocks are essentially the categorization of those deficiencies. So we have things like content, data, model, architecture, and Micropurple, which we'll get to in a little bit, essentially describes deficiencies in the test itself. But what we're constructing with this is a pool of either MITRE attacks that have been tested or haven't been tested, the deficiencies that we know exist based on the tests that we have done, and then how we've categorized those as either a content issue, so maybe a rule's not working or a playbook's missing, a data issue, there's no log or there's no aggregation source, a model, so there's some kind of analytical problem, and then architecture. Maybe we need a solution or something like that. And all of that together is essentially building blocks to let you construct whatever strategy you want based on which tasks you want to focus on given your strategy.
And recognizing that Agile is a thing unto itself, there's many beastly books that have been written about the nuances of it. Our approach was to select only those elements that made sense to us in the context of continuous improvement of our program. And so some of those that we picked, of course, the sprint. The sprint gives us the agility to respond to changes in the threat landscape, as well as insulates us against making mistakes. So if we decide to prioritize a couple of the wrong techniques, at worst we lost some velocity in terms of chasing the right ones. The other piece that we adopted is the idea of a daily stand-up. And so because it's operational, because it's easy to lose focus, because we know that we like to chase shiny objects, it really helps us to have that daily touch point to come together and re-articulate our commitment to what we're going to be working on that day. We also included the retrospective from Agile, and so at the end of every sprint, we sit down and we talk through what worked, what didn't, and we make adjustments to the process every 2 weeks. So we're improving the process itself. And then the final piece that we adopted is grooming the backlog. And so this, in terms of our build, I can personally say this is probably the most difficult part for us. And we've seen some great presentations so far that have talked about the different approaches that you can apply, where you're able to blend threat intelligence, you're able to blend penetration tests, you're able to blend red team results, all into a prioritization for your backlog of things that you need to build out and improve.
Winning over skeptics. So I'm a skeptic. I'm sure most good people are. That's kind of why we're here, right? We don't trust some of the things people say. We validate them, and then we trust them ourselves. And one of the things you're going to run into, especially if you're pitching a program like this, where we're going to change what we're going to focus on, and we're also going to have you do these agile things, and then 3 months later, you're going to reach, the promised land. That's a difficult thing, especially when you're dealing with technical resources on a blue team who already have things to do, and then this is the extra ask. One of the things that we found that works pretty well is to actually sit down and do some tabletop exercises. I'm sure some of this has already been covered, but you can pick a threat that maybe the organization was subjected to previously, or they may be and it's a high priority, decompose it into the behaviors, get everybody in a room, figure out, based on those behaviors and these techniques that it represents, what do we have in place? What deficiencies do we think are going to come of that because we can't detect it? Can we respond to it? Can we prevent it through any means? And when you go through that exercise, it's actually very, very informing because it takes a long time. Which clearly now the understanding of the fact that you need to have something to deal with that and to kind of break it up into smaller pieces becomes true. And then you're also dealing with a lot of data. So you're going to come up with a lot of deficiencies, a lot of answers around, I don't know if that's actually possible or not. And that has really kind of resonated with people as to kind of see why these processes are necessary and why the overhead of doing something like Agile, continuous improvement, makes a lot of sense.
So now the second thing that we found effective in helping with the adoption of ATT&CK, I think is a common theme that we've heard and we're going to continue to hear is that you should test against the ATT&CK framework itself. And the way that we did that was to introduce this concept called Micropurple. Micropurple is philosophically test-driven development, where the unit tests are bounded by each one of the attack techniques. It provides for us immediate feedback, so when you're writing content, you run the unit test, and then you can refine your content immediately and know if it's working or not. And it also does something interesting to the team, in that the team has found it actually pretty fun to be able to put on this hat. And in what they're effectively doing is it's giving the blue team an opportunity to practice red techniques that maybe they normally wouldn't get to perform in their day-to-day jobs.
So to summarize, if you're going to create a Micropurple capability, it's obvious that this has existed at the organization at a higher level, right? You have pen test teams, red teams that are supposed to inform ultimately the blue team to take some sort of input and do something about it to prevent it from happening in the future. We're not trying to replicate that. We're trying to internalize a small piece of that. And the reasons for that is because we need scale. We need to do this over a large amount of things, and we need to do it very, very fast, much faster than a red team or a pen test can execute because they're doing larger campaigns of things. And the things that they are looking at may not even be aligned with things that you're interested in because maybe you already know about them. Now we're focusing on things that we don't know about, but you're getting hit with pen test reports or red team simulations that are just, maybe talking about a vulnerability that they've used 3 times now on you. And that's fine. That needs to exist at a higher level. What we're talking about is compartmentalizing that, internalizing it inside a blue team, which I think naturally people have done as part of the attack matrix. Blue team has been executing these types of tests because that's required to really figure anything out. But if you formalize that and you put process around it and you actually track it, you can really prioritize what you're doing. So we bring it in-house, meaning we have a couple blue team people run these tests. They're not pen testers. They're not being trained to be pen testers. They're just they have the skills to run an average pen tester's tool. And you iterate on that across all the techniques that you've assigned to them for a current sprint. It's low sophistication. So we're just talking about the basic technique that would be outlined, in the description from MITRE. And it's low cost because it's very targeted. So instead of hiring a pen tester to pen test the environment and maybe hit some of our areas, we're targeting very specific techniques very quickly, and we're getting feedback to give us that real-time tactical information about the environment. Now, you do all that testing, right? And it's great. You get results. You're tracking it in Jira or whatever tool you're using to do the workflow. You have to provide context around that. And with the MITRE attack matrix, you impulsively want to say, because this is possible and because we have this ability to detect that technique, now we can detect that technique. And making a blanket statement like that is dangerous, right? Because any small iteration of that you're not aware of may work. So you need to qualify the test that was done. And the best way to qualify that is really using metrics. And what those metrics capture is up to you, up to your organization. But you want to capture basic things like complexity and prevention, right? Because what sophistication do you believe you actually detected that? What sophistication level is required to overcome that? So while you're doing testing rapidly through Micropurple, that is your opportunity to capture the metrics that you need about each test as you go through matrix or whatever techniques have been prioritized.
Now, the metrics themselves are interesting because they have the obvious use of being used to prioritize the work that we do. So the metrics feed back into this continuous improvement cycle. But what I've found is that there's 2 other use cases for metrics that are very helpful in the adoption. The first is that the team is excited about the metrics themselves because now we finally have a way to articulate to other people what it is we do all day, what value we're bringing to the organization, and we can do that in a very rigorous and defined way. The second thing that I found is the metrics themselves serve as a bridge to other people who maybe aren't versed in attack, aren't versed in information security. And so I was giving a presentation on our approach to our management all hands. And at the end of the presentation, one of the vice presidents came up to me. He goes, I like what you're doing, but it really came together for me when you showed me the heat map, when you showed me the metrics slide that explained the outcome that you guys were looking for. That's when I understood, and that's when I got it, and that's why I'm behind what you guys are doing.
So as far as metrics goes, there's a lot of options here. I mean, you can come up with a lot of different attributes that you want to capture. We stuck with detection, prevention, and response. We're not going to get too far in the weeds here about all the different features that you could come up with. But what I will say is measuring prevention is interesting. and dangerous at the same time, because you always want to have context around complexity, right? Because any one of your detective measures or preventative measures can be overcome with resources and time. Like, that's what we're in the business of, right? We spend money on something, threat actor spends more money, they win. You need to capture that.
So now this question is interesting, right? Could this happen to us? And I'm always reminded of the way that we used to get this done. Is somebody would read about something in a newspaper, and we'd take a look at the attack, and we'd look at the different components of the attack was described. And for each one of those components, we'd figure out if we had a control in place that we thought would work against that component of the attack. The attack used malware. Well, we've got anti-malware. Check. And we'd go through and we'd knock down all the different pillars of whatever was described in the newspaper article. And then once we had knocked them all down, we reported back to executive leadership, there's no way this could happen here.
Exactly. And I think we're all familiar with that kind of question, right? You can rephrase it as, are we vulnerable to whatever? The question comes from leadership or whoever based on the news outlet that they watch and the time of day. Usually they're coming in the morning or or late at night when someone sees something and they want to know, okay, what's the state of the program? Is this going to happen to us? And when you look at the process, when you do the Micropurple testing, you capture the metrics, you track the workflow, and you prioritize the issues that make the most sense to you and that are highest priority to you while juggling your operations, you can answer that question in an intelligent way. And for the longest time in security, that's never been possible. Until now, until you've had a finite space like the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, and you've had a way to prioritize what you're working on and capture real metrics, now you can answer that question and say, well, are we vulnerable to this threat? Let's decompose it into the behaviors and techniques. Let's see if we've tested that. What are the metrics we have? And if they're good, then yeah, we believe that this threat exhibits these behaviors. Therefore, we're comfortable that we're covered. Now, if you haven't tested it or you don't have good metrics for that particular behavior that the threat's exhibiting, you can also make a statement around, we can't do this, but maybe if we invested in technology or any of those areas that could help us in detection or prevention, we could detect that. And by the way, we could also detect these other threats. And it makes your discussion around investments and things like that very powerful. So through this process, being able to answer that question with real data is one of the most promising things.
Which is just awesome, right? We see the tremendous potential in the ATT&CK framework and all of its applications, but we also recognize that there's some significant barriers to adoption in our respective organizations, and there's effort that goes into bringing it in. And making it an integral part of your program. We believe that Agile combined with ATT&CK gives you a systematic and incremental way to manage some of those risks, not just the cultural ones, but also the operational risks that sap away at the hours that we have to give to this problem every day. Well, we hope that in sharing our experiences that you're able to have a fantastic journey with ATT&CK as well.